There is a frighteningly accurate barometer for measuring the health of a person's spiritual life. It is not their biblical knowledge, nor their church attendance, nor even their public morality. Philip Henry, a keen observer of the human soul, said that apostasy usually begins at the bedroom door, in that secret space where only God sees. It is there, in the silence of secret duty, that the soul thrives or begins to die, and many of us are dying by neglecting that place. We treat prayer in strange ways. For some, it is a shopping list for God. For others, a formal, cold, and lifeless ritual. And for many, it is the panic button, the last resort when medicine, finances, and logic fail. We see prayer as an event, something we do when we need something. But what if prayer is not primarily an event, but a state of being? This is the idea that changes everything, proposed by a 17th century monk known as Brother Lawrence. For him, prayer was, above all, a sense of the presence of God. Let's focus on this, as it is the foundation that most of us are missing. Brother Lawrence worked in a monastery kitchen. It was noisy, repetitive, and mundane work. Yet, he claimed something radical. The time of business does not differ for me from the time of prayer. How is this possible? Lawrence understood that sanctification, the process of being made holy, did not depend on changing our works. It didn't mean he needed to stop washing pans to go pray. It meant that he needed to do for the love of God what he commonly did for himself. Prayer for him was the constant practice of turning his mind back to God, no matter what he was doing. It was transforming the act of cooking, walking, or working into a silent, continuous dialogue with the Creator. Prayer becomes the atmosphere we breathe, not just the air we seek in moments of suffocation. He says we should surrender ourselves to God in all things, whether temporal or spiritual, and seek satisfaction only in fulfilling His will. If God guides us through suffering, it is the same as being guided by consolation, because God is in both. This is radical. It means that prayer is not an escape from reality. It is total engagement with reality, recognizing God within it. The problem is that this sense of presence seems too passive for us, and this is where our understanding breaks down. We think, okay, if prayer is just feeling God's presence, where is the power? Where is the change? Where are the mountains moving? A man can even pray day and night, the text says, and still be deceived. But at the same time, no one can be sure of their sincerity if they do not pray. Why? Because, as Coleridge said, prayer is more than a feeling. It is faith passing into act. It is the union of our will and our intellect. It is the whole man who prays. Anything less than that is wishing. It is lip work, a farce, or a mummery. When the whole man engages in the constant presence of God, prayer ceases to be just a discipline and becomes a power. When prayer is the whole man, moving in the presence of God, it becomes the most potent force in the universe. The original text is bold. The prayer of faith is the only power in the universe to which the great Jehovah yields. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a historical and biblical fact. The power of prayer is manifested in its ability to arrest and change the declared purposes of God. Think of Abimelech. God struck him, closing the wombs of all the women in his house because of Sarah. Judgment was in action, but Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech. Prayer reversed a divine action. Think of Job. His friends, the miserable comforters, sinned so much against Job that God's wrath was kindled against them. The situation was terrible, and what was God's solution? My servant Job shall pray for you. I will accept him. And we read, the Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed for his friends. One man's deliverance was conditioned on his intercession for others. Think of Jonah. In direct rebellion, he is thrown into the sea, swallowed by a fish. He is in a terrible condition. But from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited him onto dry land. The prayer of a disobedient prophet coming from the deepest place of misery was enough to command creation. Even the pagan Pharaoh, the hardest heart in Egypt, believed in the power of prayer. 4 times, as the plagues destroyed his land, he begged Moses, "Pray to the Lord for me." He knew that prayer was the only thing that could stop what God had started. But the power of prayer goes beyond reversing plagues or healing sicknesses. Prayer, in its most intense moments, seems to change divine decrees. This is theologically uncomfortable for many. How can a man's prayer change the decree of the sovereign God? Let's look at Nineveh. God's message through Jonah was unequivocal. In 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown. It was not a conditional warning, it was a sentence. But the people of Nineveh, from the king to the least, covered themselves in sackcloth, sat in ashes, and cried mightily to God. What was the result? God relented of the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. The prayer of an entire city, an act of collective desperation, stayed the hand of judgment. The most striking case is perhaps that of Hezekiah. The prophet Isaiah, the very mouth of God, delivers the message, "Set your house in order, for you shall die, you shall not live." This is not a medical diagnosis, it is a divine death decree. What does Hezekiah do? He could not fight, he could not argue with biology. He turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. He wept bitterly. God's response was immediate. Before Isaiah had left the middle court, God told him, "Go back and say to Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. Behold, I will add 15 years to your life." Prayer not only healed his illness, it rewrote his obituary. These men did not have a fleeting hope in prayer, they had faith in prayer. For them, it was a fact that God heard, and that God's power to do was equal to his willingness to hear. At this point, the question is obvious. If prayer has this power, why are our lives so powerless? The history of Israel gives us the answer. The text says, "Strange as it seems, there was a laxity in prayer. The power that terrified their enemies lost its grip." The cold, lifeless prayer of the Pharisee replaced the genuine approach. They turned their faces to pagan gods and cried in vain for answers that could never come. They lost the power because they lost the fire. The text gives us a powerful analogy. Prayer is like the temple incense. Preparing the incense required effort, work, and care. The spices, the graces, needed to be beaten, refined, and mixed. Prayer, the text says, is not lazy work. But the spices, however rich, were nothing until fire touched them. It is the fire consuming the spices that releases the fragrance and makes it rise to God's throne. Without fire, prayer has no spirit. It is dead. The casual, intermittent prayer we offer when we remember is never bathed in this divine fire. The fire only comes to the man who is serious about prayer. The man who clings to God, determined not to let him go until the blessing comes. This is why Paul's counsel was, "Pray continually." This fire requires struggle. Martin Luther, when asked about his plans for the next day, gave an answer that defines this struggle. He said, "Work, work, from early morning until late. In fact, I have so much to do that I will spend the first 3 hours in prayer." This is not a contradiction. It is the logic of the kingdom. Luther knew that the power for his work did not come from his effort, but from the 3 hours on his knees that preceded it. Oliver Cromwell, another man who changed the course of history, reportedly told a friend, "Make my statue on its knees, for that is how I reached glory." The fire only descends when the whole heart is seized by the passion of prayer, for the text says, "No one except the fervent man has access to God's ear." We began with Brother Lawrence, with prayer as a sense of presence, but we end with Luther, with prayer as a 3-hour battle. Are these two ideas contradictory? No. They are the two halves of the same truth. Brother Lawrence's sense of presence is the goal. It is the state of constant communion. But Luther's fire and struggle are the method. It is what we do to maintain that presence in a fallen world that tries to steal it every second. Dr. Adoniram Judson Gordon said, "You can do more than pray after you have prayed, but you cannot do more than pray until you have prayed." Prayer is the prerequisite for everything else. That is why Alexander White called prayer the greatest and best talent God gives. The prayer life is the best interest, the best investment we can bring to God. Henry Martyn, burning out his life as a missionary, summarized it all. Let me burn out for God. After all, prayer is the great thing. Oh, that I may be a man of prayer. The history of faith, from Abraham to Moses, from Hezekiah to Luther, from Lawrence to Martin, is the story of men and women who understood that prayer is not just part of the Christian life. It is the life. It is the key of the morning and the bolt of the evening. It is the fire that consumes the sacrifice, and it is the constant presence of Christ, our great intercessor, who gives us the right to approach the throne of grace. What does prayer mean to you? Is it a constant presence or an intense struggle? Leave your experience in the comments. And if this deep dive into the history and theology of faith is what you are looking for, subscribe and activate notifications.